Bonsoir, mon nom est Véronique Morin, je suis journaliste scientifique à Télé-Québec sur une émission qui s'appelle Le Code Chastenay. I am really pleased to be with you to animate this 1 hour of discussion, which will be passionate, because we'll talk about big ideas, the big picture perspective in science policy, and I would like you to welcome our distinguished guests, Ian Chubb from Australia, that came right from down under, if you want to meet me on the podium. Ian Chubb is chief scientist, as well as we have the first chief scientist of Quebec, Rémi Quirion, qui est aussi le président du conseil d'administration du conseil de recherche, un nouveau conseil de recherche scientifique québécois. Welcome. And finally, please welcome Mr. Peter McKinnon, who is the author and a member of the STIC Science and Technology Innovation Council, and the author of the very important reports from the same group, and also the president of University of Saskatchewan. Welcome to you three. We're looking forward to hearing your ideas in a moment, but first I'd like to invite the president of INSERT, Madame Suzanne Fortier, qui est la présidente du Conseil de recherche des sciences naturelles et de génie du Canada. Welcome, Madame Fortier.
Merci, c'est vraiment un plaisir de revoir autant de collègues et d'amis ce soir à notre rencontre annuelle maintenant de la conférence sur les politiques scientifiques canadiennes. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference to giving me this great occasion to talk a little bit about science and innovation. As I'm sure you can imagine, science and innovation are very much on our mind at NSERC. In fact, they're very much on our mind in Canada. In fact, in every country in the world, as we all realize that the future well-being of our countries and our planet increasingly depend on our science and innovation capacity and policy. I must say that the most eloquent and convincing arguments I've ever heard about the importance of strong science and innovation commitments and policies came from people who live in the most disadvantaged countries and economies of our world. They see on a daily basis the impact on their people, the hardship and suffering of their fellow citizens, and they are absolutely convinced that science and innovation are key to creating a better future for themselves. In advanced economies, such as ours in Canada, we of course also understand that our future prosperity depends on our innovation capacity. And increasingly, we understand that prosperity cannot be defined uniquely in economic terms. We know now that any definition of prosperity that will contribute to our well-being will be inclusive of social and cultural prosperity. We understand that innovation is a team sport. On comprend maintenant que l'innovation est un sport d'équipe qui doit rassembler plusieurs compétences, plusieurs perspectives. And we know that to be successful, we need to be keenly aware of our role on the team. We need to play to the best of our capacity, give it our all, our energies, our effort. And we need to pass the puck at the right time. Au Canada, on comprend très bien l'importance de déguiser nos patins et de passer la rondelle au bon moment. Et ce qui est vrai dans des domaines compétitifs comme notre sport national est aussi vrai dans la science et l'innovation. We are also, I think, keenly aware of the fact that prosperity can no longer be defined strictly at a local or even at a national level. Events such as the financial crisis that we're still going through, pandemics, global warming, have made us understand that we're all in this together, whether we like it or not. We are all citizens of the same planet. These are very profound changes. They're unsettling changes, as we all sense, I think, that we're in the midst of a very significant and irreversible transition. It's leaving us uncertain about what our world will look like 10 years from now, let alone what the world our children and grandchildren will live in. It is also offering us great opportunities, and we must seize them. Of course, we know that we need to have public policies that can address some of the immediate issues that are facing us. But I think more importantly, we need to have the wisdom and the imagination to see the big picture and see much further ahead. And we need to recognize those very, very special individuals who have this unique talent of seeing much further than most of us can. Des visionnaires, I think in English we call them luminaries. Luminaries, people we call nation builders, and increasingly stewards of our planet. Alors, on en a ici qui vont discuter avec nous de leurs idées et de leurs visions. So we have this incredible opportunity tonight to hear from such people. And like you, I am enormously looking forward to their remarks and to the discussion. Merci beaucoup.
Alors maintenant, j'aimerais inviter, I would like to invite each and every one of you to tell us what your job is all about. Chief Scientist sounds very important, and a member of an important group of people also stick. So would you please take a few minutes just to tell us what it involves? Let's start with Dr. Chubb, if you will.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My job before this one was I was president of the Australian National University based in Canberra in Australia. I then happily retired, and I vowed to hit many golf balls, and if the last few were better than the first few, I'd do it all over again. I didn't hit any golf balls because I was offered this job as Chief Scientist for Australia. The role is primarily to advise government on scientific issues that they are interested in. The Prime Minister, the Minister for Innovation, Industry, Science and Research, and other ministers in the government. I also have the responsibility to bring to their attention things that are, or things they should be interested in, that are emerging on the scientific landscape. I also have the responsibility to advocate for science broadly within Australia, but also to an extent Australian science internationally. And that means giving or having engagement with many groups from year or primary school children whose I have to sit down so that we can have a photograph taken together, through secondary school and through the university sector, which of course after many years in that I know much better, and engaging with the public more openly, using the variety of options available to me and to them. We're trying to raise the profile of science in Australia, to establish it as the thing that the community generally should have trust in. Trust in the institutions of science and the institution itself of science, and to elevate it to a position where the public not only supports it but actually wants it to happen, because when they want it to happen, politicians respond to them. So there is a little loop we're trying to create that will in fact make science in Australia prosper, and I have a significant advisory role in that, but I don't determine the budgets.
Bonsoir à tous et merci pour l'invitation. C'est un plaisir d'être avec vous ici et de passer une heure à discuter là, d'innovation, de recherche, de science à Canada, international, Australie. I started in the job on September the 1st, so it's still rather new. But since that time, I changed minister on September the 4th. I changed deputy minister on September the 30th, and the two staff in charge of research in the minister's office moved out as well. One to University of Montreal, one to McGill University.
That's a success.
So I think people start to be a little bit afraid of me. To say, what's wrong with him? When he's around, people leave. No, it's a great challenge, great fun, brand new, so it's still fun. But the Quebec government basically would like to integrate research a bit better. So the advisory role is there as well, advisor to various ministers, but especially the one dealing with innovation. But also partnership at the international level. So when I met the new minister for the first time, he's an engineer by training, Minister Ahmad. He told me, Remy, you don't have to convince me of the importance of research. I said, oof, please, research 101. But then he said, Quebec is small, we have good scientists, but we need to make sure that we develop international partnership, otherwise the impact of what we do here will not be as big as it could be. So that fit my vision very well as well in terms of trying, is it not loud enough? Okay. In terms of trying to build more partnership with the US, with Australia, with other countries of the world. The mandate and the organization is a bit different from Australia or some other country. So we have 3 boards, 3 councils, a bit like in Ottawa. One that deal with health, one that deal with we call nature and technology, so similar to INSERC, and one that deal with social aspect and humanities. So we are keeping the 3 fonds with their mission, and I'm chairing the board of each of these ones. So in a sense, having some kind of role there in terms of influencing how each of the boards see its mission and spend its money, in a sense. Et c'est très important de garder l'identité de chacun de ces fonds-là. Donc, ils vont garder les budgets actuels et on espère augmenter de façon significative le budget de chacun des fonds. It's a total of $200 million for the 3 funds. So we hope to increase that, and these guys, the mandate of each of the funds is to support of salary award at all levels, support of infrastructure, and support of some research program, in partnership often with federal government. So that continue. We add a layer, that would be my office, on what we call projets intersectoriaux. So basically between these 3 funds, large projects that eventually could have large impact locally in Quebec, but also in Canada and also worldwide. Just one example, the favorite son of the Quebec government these days, Prime Minister, the Plan Nord, the development of the North in Quebec. And at the moment, it's more focused on engineering, mining, transport, and that. Now we're trying to say, okay, can we engage the 3 community for each of the 4 so that we have a Plan Nord that take into consideration cultural aspect, health aspect, and so on, climate change, so that eventually Quebec become a leader. The next big thing for us as well, as part of my mandate, is the next generation of scientists. How are we going to train them, especially for this kind of large project that mix culture and mix ways of doing business? So that's something that we want to focus quite a bit, and of course there, we will need to work with the university. Because if the university say no, we continue to train the people as before, of course it will not move that much. Also, a bit like in Australia, mandate to try to promote science and research in Quebec so that, yes, RK continue to be a big one, but maybe science gained a little bit of visibility in the community as well. So early days, but a lot of fun.
And I guess it's in the same spirit that this STIC group was formed involving presidents of universities. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about this, Mr. McKinnon, how your report influenced our decisions.
Well, merci, and thank you very much. Congratulations to the conference organizers. It's wonderful to sit here and look out upon an audience of overwhelmingly younger people. I think that in itself is a very good sign as we approach the topics on the agenda for the conference. I am by background a lawyer and a law professor, and you might fairly ask, what on earth is he doing here at a conference in science policy? I became president of the University of Saskatchewan in 1999 and immediately found myself involved in one way or another with the construction of a third-generation synchrotron, the Canadian light source on our university campus, which today amounts to a capital investment of over $300 million and involves partnerships among large numbers of universities as well as industry sector partners. And the sod was turned on that project in the second month of my university presidency, and so I became quite interested, as you can well imagine, in all that was involved in the construction, the operation of a third-generation synchrotron. More recently, we have constructed an international vaccine center, the primary feature of which is a capacity to do level 3 containment work with large animals, which is a tremendously important part of infectious diseases work. And so once again, a large project, a $140 million laboratory. So the two of them together, over $500 million in capital investment, and the stakes were very high in ensuring that they were operating. We've had wonderful people involved in that, but necessarily I have remained in touch with the conversation around these facilities. More recently, I was appointed to the Science, Technology, Innovation Council, which was set up as a new body in 2007, the fall of 2007. There are 18 members of this council from the senior levels of government, a number of deputy ministers, from universities, university presidents, and distinguished faculty members in the sciences at Canadian universities, and a number of industry representatives. So industry, government, and universities all represented in the Science, Technology, Innovation Council under the leadership of our chair, Howard Alper. STIC has a twofold mandate. One is to provide advice to the federal government in matters that are referred to us. We don't just conjure up advice on all kinds of matters. Matters are referred to us. We take them under consideration, usually working groups reporting to the full council. And that advice, as you can imagine, is passed on to the cabinet on a confidential basis. The work of STIC that I've been very heavily involved in has been the second of the two mandates of the body, and that is to prepare a State of the Nation report on science, technology, and innovation. I'm on the working group with Heather Monroe Bloom. We have been involved in oversight of that project. She, of course, the principal of McGill. And we have now produced two of these reports, the State of the Nation in 2008 and the State of the Nation report in 2010. Benchmarking is a vitally, I think, important part of all of our work. We have to know where we stand, we have to know where we've come from, and we have to know what kind of progress we are making. And that is the primary purpose of the State of the Nation report, to facilitate basically evidence-based decision making. And so that's been a very, very, I think, productive part of what STIC has done. The plan will be to produce a State of the Nation report every 2 years, and we'll be able to say, I think, clearly whether or not we are making progress, in what respects we have improved, in what respects we have not or have declined, and we intend to say that very directly and very clearly in the State of the Nation report. Very, very quickly, just briefly, I think it's fair to say that the leading features of our report have been on the positive side. We know that there's a lot of talent in our country. We know, too, that the research in our country is very good. There are areas, though, where we are vulnerable, and you know what they are. Business R&D, and of course, the great problem of connectivity, connecting the dots along the innovation spectrum. And those are the kinds of issues that I think we've been able to point to with clarity and with evidence in our STIC reports.
As Dr. Fortier said, the world feels as if it's in turmoil economically, certainly. Social challenges, climate change, name it, disasters. And it feels like, I'm sure for everyone here, that science can bring solutions to all of those. But it appears that it isn't at the moment. And I'd like to ask our guests right now why it isn't so. And you know, first of all, is it your feeling also that science can do more? Whoever wants to answer first.
Well, I'll start off simply by observing that at last count we were 7 billion people and counting. We all need to be housed, we all need to be fed, we all need to be productively engaged in our societies. It's fundamentally important that we do this, and certainly old economies are not going to do it for us. We're going to have a highly advanced, scientifically fed innovation economy in order for us to make progress. I think, as Suzanne said in her opening words, that the future well-being of us depends on this, and we have to make progress here quickly.
I think Dr. Chow wanted to add. You felt really passionate about this when we spoke on the phone last.
So I agree with those comments. I think the reality is that we presently have 7 billion people on the planet, and we can only feed 6 billion. So it's okay for me, I'll go and have a good meal after this, but there are a lot of people who haven't had a good meal. 200 million of those underfed people are children. The population is projected to grow to 9 billion by 2050. If we think that we will be able to survive as a humanity if all we do is more of what we do now, then we're crazy. We actually have to do things differently. We have to do things better. We have to raise yields of plants and food. We have to maybe do them through some genetic manipulation, whatever it might be. I don't have the solutions in my head, but I have the problem pretty clearly identified. And I think that for scientists or for communities to think it's okay because we can go home and eat, but the world can't, and we do nothing about it, or that we're happy to do more of what we do now, a little bit, and get into this incrementalism, I think is a silly and sad situation for us to be in. I think the additional issue is that most of these problems won't be solved by any one country. So in Australia, we produce enough food for 60 million people at the moment, or to contribute to the diets of 60 million people. We are 22 million people. So one of two things that means: we're either very well fed or we export. We export. But we will never be the food basket of the world, because we won't have the capacity to produce a lot more than 60 food to contribute to 60 million people's diet, because we are degrading our land. The rainfall patterns in Australia are shifting away from the presently arable land. The demands are ever higher. And as our own population grows, we will expand the footprints of our cities, and they in turn will take over arable land. We're a dry continent, we will use up our water, so we won't have the capacity to irrigate as we used to do. So we simply cannot go on thinking that all we have to do is make incremental changes in what we presently do to survive. And we can't think that we can do it on our own. So we have to do it with other people in other countries. We've got to identify some of those big issues, whether it's food, whether it's pandemics. I mean, Australia was paralysed over bird flu. We were all frightened we were going to get it. But we couldn't solve the problem on our own. We might get a few vaccines for Australians, and we eventually did produce vaccine, but the reality is the birds still kept coming. And we won't be able to do much about that unless we work with people in other countries. As I've often remarked, the birds don't look down and say, oh, I better go get a visa, I'm flying into Australia. They actually just come. So all of these issues will be resolved by people working together, not by people presuming that they can do it on their own and assuming that they have all the wisdom that you need to bring to bear on some of these big global issues. These are issues that confront humanity, and humanity's got to work on them.
But just to add a little bit to that, I think we all know that that science and innovation is done by very creative people, very creative mind, and we have to use that to build the next economy. And as was said, it's not just the same way of doing business, but just about everything that we think that's green chemistry, green bus, green plane, whatever. There's a new field, a new economy to be created there. And if we all work together on that in Canada but worldwide, I think we can reverse the trend in terms of economic loss by using these people, the very creative mind, and the young people are there and they are willing. They are very concerned by climate change, by environment, and all these things. So I think the time is now. We cannot wait any longer.
So we've got talent. We've got money, but maybe not enough. What is missing? What are the dots missing connecting all this talent, all these scientific research produced each year in Canada to bring it forth to commercialization and innovation to, help people serve the public?
Well, I can tell you a bit about what happens in Australia. What happens in Australia is that we are not working together cohesively within the country in the way that I think the government would want and that is indeed necessary. So, for example, we have 8.5 people with a doctorate per 1,000 of our workforce. But most of them classify themselves as researchers, so we have very few people with that high level of training. There are some, but we have very few people with that high level of training in the general workforce. When I ask employers why not, they say because they want too much money, they think they know everything, they can't work in teams, and anyway it takes too long to train them to work in our industry. Now, so what we're actually doing in a way is we are, as I said semi-humorously earlier, that if you have a PhD and you want a job outside the research and research agencies and universities, you would pretend that you didn't have a PhD in order to increase your chances of getting it. And that seems to me to be bizarre. So if you tell the employers they've got to, they won't. If you tell the universities they've got to change the way they produce PhD graduates to make them, to develop overtly some of the more generic skills that they would need to be able to work in a workplace that was not a research workplace, and at the same time psychologically not to see that as second best, because we used to train, I've said it many times, but I was trained by somebody in exactly the same way he got his PhD. And I trained my PhD students in exactly the way I was trained, and I'll bet you they're out there now doing to their students what was done unto them by me. So, and they wanted my job. Well, that was okay. They didn't get it, but they tried. But the most important part is that we have not sort of systematically gone back and said, well, what are the career choices? How do we get an innovative workforce? How do we prepare people for the innovation and the response to innovation that's needed? So it's all very well for scientists in universities, of which I was one for a long time, have good ideas, all of that sort of stuff. And you take it to people who are less well prepared for running with that and turning it into product and service that betters the lot of humankind, because we've got sort of segments. And so my view in Australia is that until the employers, the universities, the government, and all of those groups actually work coherently together to look at how you build capacity for that innovation, we will still be talking about we wish and what we wish in 20 years, just as we've been talking about it for the last 20 years. So we do have to do something to break. We've got to crack the egg to cook the omelette, and it will mean getting people together in different ways, identify the problems, the solutions, and get on with it. So the good ideas go into a receptive environment, not to one which is sort of, as it were, handing it over, stepping back and let somebody else carry it forward, but whose predilections are not to employ the sorts of people who will easily take that forward. So I think that's the Australian position. The Australian government's doing a lot to try to change it. I think it's got a bit of traction and it will change, but I think that we need to put the foot on the accelerator and get more substantial change more quickly.
And on that front as well, my boss, they just announced, the Quebec government announced yesterday an investment of up to $250 million to help SME to be a bit more innovative, because in Canada, the bulk of employers are small and medium-sized enterprises. Same thing in Quebec, of course. But often these guys, they have nobody. There's few employees, they don't have the resources, so we send them from university. They could go and do some training, some part of their training in the industry. But the reverse does not happen too often. So what about trying to help maybe someone working in an SME, government picking up the salary for a little while, that person come to a university and they start to understand the culture of each other. So we'll see if it works. Again, this was just announced yesterday. But that's something that we want to try in Quebec.
It's the old problem. We have to bring scientists and innovators together. We have to do it in a far more pervasive way than we've been able to do it to date. I think we have some wonderful examples of success. I spent some time just a few months ago at Mars, and it was a marvelous example of where this is being done, and to all appearances being done well. We have some very successful research parks at different institutions across the country. I know at my own university we have a research park with 140 tenants, almost all, about 85% of them would be private sector, and very substantial biotechnology clusters, and so we're able to bring scientists and innovators together, but we need to be able to do it far more pervasively, far more comprehensively than we've done it to date, and we need to be able to provide the support, the venture capital, and that remains one of the very difficult problems in the economic landscape.
Do you feel that there's a need for a superstructure like what is recommended in the Jenkins report that will determine which sector should be?
Well, I think that's the first recommendation in the Jenkins report. It's a very, very important recommendation, and I hope we're able to take a look at it and assess its merits, and perhaps, if found to be helpful, we could move ahead on that. It'd be nice to see.
And do you have that kind of structure in Australia?
So we have rough equivalents. We've got an innovation board, they allocate funds and so on. The government has introduced a couple of newer schemes, Commercialisation Australia, which fills that gap between where the venture capitalists might be less risk averse, because we've taken it from proof of concept, so that they actually have the capacity now to allocate grants to get things beyond an idea through proof of concept. So the history was that if in a university somebody had a really good idea that was pretty reasonably likely to go to new product or service, that they would have to sell a lot of the intellectual capital and intellectual property early in order to get money to take it through proof of concept. So when the university went out and said, now we've got something where the concept is proven, then they own 5% and not all, or whatever it happened to be. So the government has tried to fill that gap. Venture capitalists in Australia are relatively conservative, notwithstanding the name, and so it was an important gap to fill. So we were talking earlier today, I think we have some quite similar structures in Australia, called different things, but it's because we face the same problems. It is, in essence, a small to medium enterprise economy. How do you get those people the support that they might need if they want to innovate, and how prepared are they to take the risk of doing something new when their own livelihood and that of their 4 or 5 or 6 employees depends on turning out a product with known responses and known returns. So it's, I think it's important that for both of us, obviously, that we get into that area and give support in a way that's different from what we've tried before, which is to say, well, you can get a bit of money if you do this. The Australian government has introduced a tax rebate scheme, which is most advantageous for small to medium enterprise, which is presently defined as having less than $20 million turnover. So it's fairly medium, I guess. But they get a tax refund for expenditure on R&D. And that includes labour costs. So it means if they employ a PhD student to work on their project, then they can claim all those costs. So I think there's movement at the station, but we've got to put people in an elevator, not on an escalator.
Any R&D, or are there specific sectors that are targeted that you know will be eventually producing innovation?
I don't think at this stage that there are any particularly targeted. The government has asked me to chair a committee which is looking at the strategic expenditure research investments over the next 5 to 10. They have a policy called Powering Ideas, which was a 10-year innovation plan. But I actually can't recall whether that identifies sectors. I don't think it does, other than more generically, like saying we have issues with manufacturing and things like that. But part of the brief that I have, I think, will be to flesh out what has existed for some time, which are national research priorities. We can't do everything, so we do have to prioritise. And when the government expenditure is involved, then we will be looking at ways in which they can strategically invest to get the return that they need to be able to do to shift our economy away from one where we, with great alacrity, dig holes in everything that hasn't got a house on it and put it in a ship and sell it to somebody. And that works well because we've got a lot, but when that runs out, we've got to have something to replace it. And that's the longer term plan that we're doing. So identifying those areas will be an important part of it.
Yeah, it's always the same problem with science. It takes so long to produce research, and I guess in a sense it's perceived as risky to put money into a research that might not produce any commercial benefits. Do you find, Rémi, I guess your Quebec government is open since they have you now. Do you feel that they know, or do you know where to prioritize 2 months in the job?
It's still early days, and I think as I mentioned earlier, I think we need a very strong base of cadre of scientists that basically do science that is not too targeted. So they explore, and some at some point will pay off. So it's very hard to predict success top down. So we need to have a very strong base, and then having ways to seduce them to be involved in targeted type of project. And in Quebec, for example, all the multimedia, video, all these type of things, there is a lot of very large firm as well as local firm that have developed in Montreal is very, very strong in multimedia. The biopharmaceutical sector was a priority of the government for many years. We have lost a lot because now it's all global. So we lost a lot of the big companies. So we have to rebuild or maybe change the strategy and work on something else. So that's something now we're looking at in the context of Plan R, which is so huge. And for Plan R, yes, innovation in an economic sense, but also innovation in a social sense is very important in Quebec, with a good glass of wine and good food.
I think there's another quality that's necessary here. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing you on it, and that is patience. We all are familiar with one of the rallying cries of impatience. What are we getting for all of these investments in R&D? The reality is that the modern investments in R&D are of rather recent origin, and I worry that in our rush to achieve results, we may not have the necessary patience to build the long-term capacity that will be required for us to succeed.
Yeah, that's certainly also like one element, one thing that we did over the past year and a half in Quebec, like many other places, is the focus on personalized medicine. So we don't know exactly what it means, but we want to do it. So finally convinced 2 ministers to invest, and they were gung-ho. They were very, very interested to invest. So they are investing, not a fortune, but $20 million So for the size of Quebec, on focus program and personalized medicine, it's not too bad. And it has to be in partnership with the private sector. So not bad. But basically the time frame on that is 3 years. 3 years to have an impact on the healthcare system in Quebec. It could take 10 years to do that. So I'm afraid that in the end of 3 years, if it's hard to deliver, then the politician will say, well, we tried that, did not work, move on to something else. So that's a very dangerous one as well.
It is, and I think if we reflect on it, it took a long time from Watson and Crick in the 1950s identifying the structured DNA to get to the point where we can talk sensibly about personalised medicine and having an impact in 3 years. And when you think of the investment from the 1950s to today in molecular biology, in the techniques, the technology, and just the understanding of what it might mean, because when they did it, I don't think they understood the full implications of it. I mean, it was an intriguing intellectual exercise that they knew was important, that people at the time knew was important. But I don't know, maybe they would say differently if they were here, but I don't know that they thought that 50 years later we'd be into personalised medicine in the way that we now know that it's heading. So there are long time frames, there is an investment needed. I think the issue, for me at least, is to get scientists to understand that the research that they do that they might consider to be intellectually exciting and very basic research, trying to understand the very nature of things, that when something comes out of that looks as though it might well be able to turn into a product or a service, that they don't put it in the drawer because it's not what they're interested in doing. And somehow we've got to make that whole thing easy, because busy scientists of high quality are not necessarily going to take a break from the bench to say, I've got to go and talk to these people to see if whatever, and have the patience to do that. So patience is a very important word in this exercise, but also is the facilitation of the processes that are needed to try to get people to say, I've got a good idea and I think that could be turned into something useful, and give it to somebody within their organisation who will do what's necessary, involving them of course, but do what's necessary to get it to the point where it does turn into something useful. And it's another gap.
On appelle ça en français mettre la charrue avant les bœufs. Hein? I don't know how to translate the expression. I'm sure you understand what I mean. But to prevent putting investment in something in science that you're not sure if it's going to give you a return, is it a good idea to align yourself with the big guy? Like, no matter how much money you're going to put into research in one field, if the big guy's not doing it, then are you doomed? And by big guys, I mean the big players, right?
Like in a field that I know best, in research on dementia, on Alzheimer's disease, the pharmaceutical industry has invested billions of dollars over the past 25 years. Academia, the funding bodies, have invested also millions, tons and tons and tons of money in terms of ways to treat the disease. We have still made no progress compared to the early 80s. So we think we understand a bit more disease, but not too much. I think what is needed now, and most of the companies are backtracking in a sense, is a bit more investment in different type of project, riskier project. Because with the fact that it's so competitive these days, when you apply to a funding council, with success rate of 15-20%, the panel will have the tendency to be very adverse to risk, a bit like a VC in a sense. Well, we're not sure. And by that, more people are doing more or less the same thing, following the same hypothesis, and maybe that's not the right thing. So one thing that I will hope I'll be able to do, I don't know yet, but be to promote very risky thing. We don't want necessarily to get to first base. We want the home run. And of course, we'll miss a lot. 90% will not work, and that's fine. But I think we need to go back a little bit more to taking more risk in academia. Industry maybe is difficult to do, but in academia, taking a bit more risk.
Right. You mean to invest in sectors that you were both in Washington. You met with your counterparts. Is this in an effort to try to work globally with other chief scientists around the world and figure out what their priorities are? Yes.
Well, yes, it is to some extent. I mean, I do think that. So Australia is a bit like Canada. We have 0.3% of the world's population. We produce a bit over 3% of the world's research output. That means there's 97% done somewhere else. So we actually have to be able to work with the people who are producing that. In order to do that, we have to be a contributor. So we can't actually sit back like we used to in the first half of the last century and say, well, we won't spend any money on it. People will just give us what we want. They gave us what they wanted to give us, not necessarily what we wanted. So the consequence was the Australian government took decisions in the 1950s to invest heavily in research and development in our universities. We produced our first PhD student in 1948, first PhD graduate from an Australian university, and has grown dramatically since then, as has the quality. I think the quality of research in Australia, generally speaking, is very good. So, but what we do need to know is we know that those individuals, many of those individuals, will produce high quality work on their own or in their own teams. The big issues that confront humanity require global cooperation. And some of the solutions that other countries are finding need to be also learnt by us so that we don't just simply repeat the mistakes of what's been learned and corrected elsewhere. So I do think it's important that we have a willingness, and I think there is a willingness. I'm not suggesting for a moment that people are reluctant to talk about these things. The question is how you formalise it. But by formalising it, what you do is you don't get in the way of the individuals who are doing good work with people who are doing good work in another country. And it's easy to bureaucratise these things and have, you know, how do we know we're going to get value for money? How many checkpoints can we put in the application form? How many application forms do you need? All of those sorts of things. So I think that we need to learn from each other, work with each other, seek to influence our respective governments to say that some of those big issues need to build off the local base, but to become part, for many of them, there are some local things which will always remain local, but for many of them, how do we work effectively together and make our respective contributions to the solution of some of the big problems? And meeting chief scientists is part of that arrangement. I mean, we will learn a lot from each other. We all make mistakes. Our governments sometimes even make mistakes. And when we learn about that, we can identify ways in which we can address them so they don't become, as it were, quasi-terminal, that they are corrected and we get on and we solve problems, which is basically what we're supposed to be doing, I think.
And it may be a little bit counterintuitive, but meeting earlier this week with colleague at the NIH, in DC, I train at the NIH, so I still know a lot of people there and develop partnership, and we sign an agreement. But the fact that the economy is not too strong in the US mean that they are more open to collaboration and partnership. They were very open this time around to partnership. We have just hired someone, Julie Payette, the former astronaut, will be the Quebec rep in DC to discuss with NSF, with NIH, to try to mingle with the foundation there to see how much we can partner a bit more, and they are quite open. So maybe during tough economic time, there is opportunity for more partnerships.
To jump in, is this what you did too? Formed a partnership with NIH when you were there as well? Yeah? Dr. Chubb? Yeah?
No, but we do have relationships and an agreement with the United States, and I think it's right that in tough economic times people are more open to innovative solutions than they might otherwise have been. So I think the opportunities for us to collaborate in that sense of having a framework within which collaborations can take place is probably more possible now than it was. The United States is our biggest international publishing partner by a long shot, but that's depended as it is yours, But that's depended very largely on individuals meeting at a conference and agreeing to do something together than it is to say there is a strategic advantage for you if you work in collaboration with partners in the US. We're also partnering the US, number of US institutions in the Giant Magellan telescope, optical telescope. We are partnering, or we are bidding for a radio telescope, and Canada will be part of the process that leads to selecting the site, we expect, but certainly a member of the team that uses the radio telescope, whichever site it goes to, us or South Africa. So there are those things happening now increasingly, because the square kilometre, the radio telescope is a square kilometre of antennae in surface area. I can't think of a single country who would think it would be worth investing $2+ billion in something like that. But clearly there are 20 countries that are willing to play a part in investing to get that infrastructure into the scientific community. And if you say, what's the value in that? Let me just tell you one little story. If you look at your mobile telephone, your cell phone right now, then the Wi-Fi system in that was invented by an Australian who was looking for radio frequency output from black holes in the near galaxy. And I don't know what he was doing looking for that, or those, but what it turned into, and it was patented in Australia, it turned into the local area network system that's in most of the mobile telephones now. And there are now royalties flowing back to Australia. It was CSIRO. The royalties are flowing back now because firms building cell phones and other gadgets used it. And they took it and didn't pay for it, so the organisation had to go to court. But that was 25 years ago. And the spin-off from these things, and the spin-off from the high-tech underpinning of major research infrastructure, is an incredibly important part of high-tech development in our countries. Canada wants to be involved because of the high-tech spin-offs that would come. Australia wants to host it, partly because we've been in radio astronomy for a long time, partly because we've got a lot of desert and you can put things in there with no mobile phones handy, but partly because of the spin-off, the high-tech spin-off that will come from having such a major piece of infrastructure. And if you asked each of the countries, they would say, yep, we're in it for the science, but we're also in it for the spin-offs that will come from having to design new equipment, new antennae, new computing capacity. I mean, it will get more data in a day than the internet has in a year or something. So there's a huge computing data processing capacity needed. No country can do that on its own.
And very hard to predict at first.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's enough room to within governments from politicians to understand that scientists are also creators and they have to be given money just to try things because it could turn out into a great invention with great spin-offs? Do you feel that there's that understanding? I see Peter McKinnon. Not sure.
Yeah, it's like the general population in a sense. So there is some politicians that understand better than the others, and of course they are all concerned by the election in 3 years' time, 4 years' time. They want to have something to show for. So I think it's probably a way also for us, and maybe it's part of the job that I have now, at least in Quebec, to explain to them a bit more what it could mean, like the impact of this huge investment, because it's a lot of money, and then when you invest in these things, you don't invest in something else. So in terms of priority and like the light source in Saskatchewan, the impact of that also for the scientific community in Canada, having access to this type of infrastructure is huge. Now in Quebec for the Plan Nord, of course it's at the beginning was mining industry, but now we have Yahoo and Google and all these kind of organizations are looking at putting some infrastructure in the north because, of course, all the heat and cloud computing and all these type of things. So they have started to do that in Finland and Sweden. So what about Quebec? So now they are scouting in the north. So that you never know. So this type of thing. But we have to have a few examples, and then I think they are receptive.
This is great. Just one point to add, and that is that politicians will attribute importance to what their electors attribute importance. And given the, I think at least the troubling state of scientific literacy in the general population, we can't be terribly confident that the politicians think their electorates think science is important. So what do we do about that? I think a much broader public education on all of these issues is very important.
And I think one issue that is very important to you, and I'm sure to you all, is the level of understanding of science culture within our country, at least. I don't know if it's the same. I mean, you do go tour for raising awareness, so I guess it is also a problem and a concern for you. So maybe you want to address this a little bit, Mr. McKinnon.
Well, culture is a very interesting word here. We've had a lot of reports on science and technology and innovation and productivity. We've had the Conference Board, the Competition Review Panel, we've had the Council of Academies, we've had 2 STIC reports, we've now had the Jenkins report, and the themes are fairly common and constant across the board. One of the things about culture that really intrigues me is the question of goals. How do we set goals for ourselves? What are our goals as Canadians for the field of science and technology? Do we have the kind of conversation going on that facilitates the setting of goals? It's a big, awkward country, and it is difficult to have the kind of multi-layered and multi-dimensional conversation around goals that we need. But I think we need to have that conversation. I think it needs to be federal and provincial. We need to decide, are we content with the fair to middling performance, or are we interested in being a leader? Can we as Canadians, federally, provincially, different regions of the country, public sector, private sector, can we come to some kind of sense of what we're really trying to do here? It's hard for me to imagine changing culture without a deeper discussion of goals.
You agree also, Mr. Kirian, that we need
Oui, non, c'est certain que tout ce qui est vulgarisation, c'est pas le bon terme, comment expliquer au public l'importance de la science, de la recherche sur leur vie, sur l'économie, que ce soit l'économie sociale ou l'économie argent. C'est toujours un peu compliqué, mais je pense qu'il faut peut-être changer un peu la façon dont nos systèmes d'éducation fonctionnent. Et ça, c'est lourd. C'est des réformes de comment on forme nos éducateurs. Et probablement pas assez. On le fait peut-être de la même façon qu'on le faisait il y a quelques décennies. Donc, il faut peut-être repenser à tout ça. La Finlande vient de sortir un rapport sur ça. Ils ont changé beaucoup leurs économies, leur façon de produire les maîtres, la formation des maîtres. Donc, peut-être qu'il y a quelque chose à faire de ce côté-là, mais it's a big task. It will take time to change that, to turn that around, so that basically education is at top of the agenda. It is not, at least not in Quebec.
Right. Well, we've got 5 more minutes, and I thought maybe I'd let you just discuss what you think is at the top of your head at the moment, or for the next few in the immediate. What are the challenges that are coming for you? Convince your governments, working together, bringing growth, making science a motor of growth and innovation, all of the above.
You summarised my thoughts precisely.
You did well.
Yeah. Sorry. I would just add one thing to the last 2 responses, and that is that we have tried to we talk to the community, and it's a significant part of my role. I think I spend seemingly most of my time giving speeches, but to community groups. But the troubling thing for me is the school education system, where I don't think we support our teachers well enough to be comfortable enough with contemporary science to enable them to excite and enthuse their students, whether that be in primary or secondary school. There was a survey done some couple of years ago of schools in Australia and what was being taught on a particular day. And a very significant proportion, I forget the exact number, but it was upwards of around about 70% of teachers were teaching out of their field on that day. So I think it must be very hard for these people to confront a class to try to teach them something with which they themselves are uncomfortable. And so we are arguing quite strongly to look at the way school education system and how we can support our teachers to do what's an unenviable task, but to give them the support they need to be able to teach students who can go home and watch what's on National Geographic and learn quite a lot about genetics from people from all around the world and go back to the class next day to be taught by somebody who's not comfortable with it. So we've got to support our teachers better. Australia too is a federation. I will finish by saying that I was reminded the last time I came to Canada and talked about federation, because we were talking about federal systems of government, and the Canadian presenters said that when he'd applied for a visa to go to Australia, he was asked if he had a criminal record, and he responded that he didn't know it was still compulsory. So we're not all like that. We do take education seriously.
Est-ce que vous avez une dernière pensée à partager avec nous?
Non, je pense que, comme je disais, du côté éducation, c'est tout à fait critique. Et aussi pour nous, partenariat avec les provinces, avec le gouvernement fédéral, c'est tout à fait essentiel, mais partenariat aussi à l'international. Et les moyens qu'on a au Québec, la communauté de chercheurs est relativement petite, donc il va falloir cibler aussi nos partenariats et choisir dans quel domaine on veut le faire pour avoir un impact en bout de ligne.
Just a sentence or two. We've had a lot of concern expressed. The reports that I mentioned earlier, 5 or 6 of them, the kind of conversation that I think has developed over recent years around science, technology, innovation. I think the trick now is to recognize that we've reported enough and we've got to move into the realm of policy, focused, serious policies and goals, and to see if we can achieve them.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Dr. Chubb, Kirion, Mr. McKinnon, thank you so much for your inspiring thoughts and visions. And for a final word, I'd like to invite again Madame la Présidente du CRSNG, Madame Suzanne Fortier. Merci.
Rebonjour. I will start with the last thought that Peter McKinnon left with us, which is that we've had enough reports. We've had excellent reports, actually, very convincing evidence that we need to move to action, and we need to move to action urgently. I was struck, as I'm sure you were, by the focus that was made early on in the conversation about one of the really big issues we're facing, a new benchmark in terms of the world population, but also, I think, quite a lot of issues to sort out to be able to have our planet Earth as a good vessel for a growing population. And I think some of the points that were made, I'm sure resonated with you as they did with me. The points that we cannot solve these problems on our own. We need to work together. We need to work together globally. We're on the same team. And also we need to work with those innovators, people who are starting new companies based on innovation. They're going to be part of the solution, and they need to be integrated in these solutions. I think these were all very, very important points, and I think your points of looking at the world ahead with these huge issues and the need to create truly a green economy are also very, very important point. I was also very interested by all of your comments about the foundation pieces that we need to be prepared to address these issues. And some of these foundation pieces are, of course, making the connections, making it easier for people to connect. I think these were a very important point, but of course also thinking about who's going to be there in 10 years from now, in 5 years from now. Who are the next generation of scientists? How are we going to train those people to make sure that they're ready to contribute into this world that we're embarking on? The quality of the education. These are very, very important points, and they're foundation elements that we need to really care about. And I think, as was mentioned, we're all eager to see results, but we have to understand that also laying the foundation is extremely important. It will take some time. It has to be a strong and broad foundation, and we need to be prepared to invest in that foundation. And the final point that I would make, and I think it's an extremely important point, was about raising the profile and increasing the interest of the general population into science and innovation. That's hugely important. And one point, and it's a very, very important point, is that we cannot take anything for granted here. I think for a long time, we as scientists have taken for granted that because of, I think, the effort we make and the study and so on, and the commitment we have to our science, that people will have full confidence in us. That cannot be taken for granted. All of us have to understand, I think, that the trust of the public in our science is not something that we can take for granted. We have, as a community, to commit to very high standards of scientific integrity, and that's a shared responsibility. It was mentioned very early on in the remark of Ian Cha, but I think it's an incredibly important element, because I think we've seen in recent events around the world that preserving public's trust in science is a key element in advancing the research and innovation that will, we all hope, create a better world for all of us. So I think that was a very, very important element. So I'm sure that you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. And I know it will continue over some refreshments and some networking. So merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for these wise words. It was a real pleasure to be with you all. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference. I'm sure you will.